The second passage of this section is also a science passage. You can tell that because it's written by a biologist, and we'll review it in detail. It's not that strange that you have two science passages, especially if you have short passages. It's very common. So let's look at paragraph 1. This passage contains 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph is the shortest, but probably the most significant. It sets up what the author is trying to convey, which is that studying the whale is difficult. It's also important to notice that he, or she perhaps, put that in a form of a metaphor, specifically a simile. That simile was stated in the very first sentence. Quote, conducting scientific research on the most challenging of groups can be compared with viewing a whale through a keyhole. Unquote. Immediately after that simile, the author follows that up with a metaphor and stating that, quote, in spite of lots of sparks and smoke, we have so far accomplished little, blah, 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 unquote. So the first paragraph is very important with the use of a simile and metaphor. The main idea is studying whales is difficult. We only have a small picture of them, and despite all of our obvious efforts, what the author called sparks and smoke, we still have learned little, and we probably won't learn a whole lot more about whales for many years. Let's go on to the next paragraph. The second paragraph is packed full of information that's useful in almost all reading passages. Rarely do you get all of this, though, in a single paragraph. It has the trifecta. It has metaphors, it has contrast language, and it has quotations. All of these are things that you need to attune yourself to in order to do well on the test. First thing we notice is the main idea here is that whales have a different time scale compared to we humans. The author actually uses a comparison, a type of metaphor, between weasels who run around very quickly compared to that of humans, and human activity compared to whale activity. Whales go at a much slower pace than humans, so it's going to be difficult to analyze their actions. They have a different time scale. The author then talks about the but. You can study whales, trying to figure them out, but you really can't. But you have not figured that out. The word but, or any contrast language such as yet, however, nonetheless, these are all important words on the SAT reading. They're usually very important. We think we understand whales, but we really can't. The contrast language offered near the top of the paragraph is reinforced at the bottom with a quotation. Notice it states at the end, only at the end of a day may one say to oneself. Quotation. Now, let me see. What did I see? Well, I saw the whale, and then I did this, and then, for heaven's sake, it was play I was looking at. What does that all mean? What does that quote mean? It means that sometimes you really have to study whales using a different rhythm, a different time scale in order to understand whales. Whales cannot be understood within the context of a human time scale. It's a reinforcement of the original main idea, but it's a main idea in itself. Whales have a different pace compared to humans. It's hard to understand that pace, but unless you understand that pace, you will not understand whales. Let's look at the final paragraph. The last paragraph is significant only for 2 reasons. First, the author talks about his motivation and enjoyment in studying whales, that he thought it would be hard to approach because he wasn't used to that slow pace, but he's learned to enjoy that slower pace. The second aspect of the paragraph that's interesting is the author has brought up another metaphor. He compares the more difficult, slower pace of studying whales to that of writing poetry in the sonnet form. A sonnet is a very mechanical, very difficult type of poem to master. It's got 14 lines. It's got all of these rules of iambic pentameters and so forth. You don't need to know that, but he's using that as a analogy and a metaphor to prove what a good job he's done. Yippee. Let's look at the questions now. Number 16 is a main idea question. You can derive that when you see the words primary purpose. This is not about recent findings. This is about whale studies over a number of years, so you can eliminate choice A. It does sort of talk about one scientist's experience with working with whales. That's a common theme, so we have to sort of keep B for the moment. They really didn't talk about other animals. They use a weasel in terms of an analogy, but not in terms of whales. So although they do sort of talk about other animals, that's not the main idea. So you can eliminate C. There's no danger. They didn't talk about another whale-related death, so you can eliminate D. And E is sort of true also. Again, with a lot of primary purpose passages, we can eliminate 3 and we have 2 true ones. But which one is this more about? Well, it's really B is the best answer because E only shows up the very last paragraph. So the correct choice there is, in fact, B. Number 17 questions your ability to understand the metaphor being used in the first paragraph. Sparks and smoke, we talked about that with our discussion. Sparks and smoke showed how much effort has been made, all to little fruition. There's been a lot of effort made, a lot of commotion has been made, but very little has actually been discovered. Choice A gives you the opposite of what the passage stated. The passage stated that unsuccessful efforts are quite common, although there's a lot of commotion. Choice A sort of comes to the opposite conclusions, therefore we can rule it out. I really don't know what they're talking about when they say the direct approach. It's probably not relevant, so let's rule out B. Choice C is just a silly choice. There's really nothing magical about science. There's nothing superstitious here, so let's rule that out. The author may be excited about studying big whales in the ocean, but he never made it seem supernatural. Choice D, maybe again, that's possible. There's been a lot of vigorous efforts. And choice E is sort of silly. There's nothing dangerous about whales. So remember, it's much easier to eliminate the 4 dumb answers than to find the correct answer. And in this particular case, the correct answer was, in fact, D. Number 18 is fairly easy. In the very first paragraph, the author spent a lot of time, both directly and by metaphor, talking about how studying whales is much different than other activities because whales are so much slower. That clearly does not involve size, intelligence, eating habits, or body shape. It involves the pace of activity. So choice E is correct in number 18. Number 19 covers the greater part of paragraph 2. It's the whole last half of it at least. And it really comes down to, did you understand those quotes? And the quotes basically said, look, you can study and study and study, and if you're not using the right methodology, you don't understand the right time scale of whales, you're not going to be able to figure it out because whales go much slower. The author never mentioned anything that suggested in choice A. They really didn't compare species except maybe humans and weasels, but that's not the point here. And you can rule out B for a similar reason. They really didn't compare humans to other animals such as whales. They just said our timescales were different. These choices miss the main idea that we talked about. The author never said that the whale had purposeless activity. The only thing the author said is we might not be able to understand that activity because we don't understand the whale's timescale. Thus, I think you should also rule out choice C. And again, in choice E, the author really does not talk that much about whale intelligence. Obviously, they're intelligent creatures, but that was not the point of either the main idea or paragraph 2. Of course, the whole purpose of the quotation is, gee, I looked at this and I looked at this and I didn't understand what it was, but then I understood it. It's something that comes almost as an afterthought. And that more or less matches up to what choice D is stating. So the correct answer of 19 is, in fact, choice D. Let's go to number 20. Number 20 reviews practically the same information that was in number 19, but it takes a slightly different perspective. I also think that number 20 is a very good example of where you have to eliminate 4 wrong answers. The scientist writing this, a biologist, he or she is telling you how his or her mind is operating. This, of course, is not an authoritative second opinion, nor does it describe an erroneous pattern of reasoning. It's just saying how his or her mind is working. I see nothing humorous in this, so you can eliminate A, C, and D. And I don't think it's a actual conversation. It's a conversation in somebody's own head. So you can eliminate E. It's telling you how that scientist's mind works. So the correct choice is, in fact, B. Number 21 refers to the last paragraph. If there's any single type of question I hate personally on the SAT reading, it's the all of the following except questions. That's because you really have to comb through the entire material in that paragraph and start finding what's included and what's not. It's a little bit on the time-consuming side. If you have a hard time with the timing on the SAT readings, you should really defer questions such as these to the very last thing that you do, because they are going to expend quite a bit of time. Going through the choices, let's start with choice E, the research the author did before turning to the study of whales. That's mentioned in the very first sentence. He starts off by saying, during the first 10 years of my career, I did this and I did this. So you can eliminate E. If you look at choice D, the change in methodology that working with whales required of the author, that's more or less covered in the very last sentence, where he says passive observations require a subtler way of thinking, and the result can be sonnets rather than ballads. In other words, he said the study of whales requires normal time to a different type of time. I am satisfied with that change. So D is talked about. Choice C, the satisfaction the author found. You can see that he is satisfied with that paragraph. He says, but, and remember, buts are important, but I soon appreciated the greater rewards of finding things out through passive observation. He certainly was satisfied, even though it was difficult. Remember, we mentioned before how important contrast language was, and this is a good example of that. And choice B, I think, is the hardest one to eliminate, the concern about the ability to conduct a different type of research. In this particular case, he did say, yet, again, another contrast word, yet I had little idea of how to make good passive field research observations. He clearly indicated a bit of concern. The only thing that really helps you here is that awareness of contrast language, and that a lot of the choices, especially D and E, are very obvious. The only thing that wasn't talked about was A, the author's motivation of choosing Wales as a subject. We really don't know why he picked Wales, he just did. Thus, choice A is the correct answer. Let's proceed to number 22. Number 22, which refers to the sonnet form, is a reference to the metaphor that the author presented. He or she mentioned the sonnet form because that represented a enjoyment you would get out of something even though it's more difficult. Remember, a sonnet form of poetry is much more complicated than most poetry. So the author is basically saying, gee, it's a little bit more complicated, but just like you enjoy something from a sonnet, you can enjoy something from this whale research. It's a type of analogy, a type of metaphor. Basically, the author is telling you that nothing is really a lot of fun if it's too easily obtained. The author is not illustrating how conciseness does anything. Choice A is out. He or she is not showing any advantages or disadvantages of any type of scientific observation, so B is out. He or she is not discarding outmoded constraints. Don't even really know what that means, so choice C is out. And he or she is certainly not offering a contrast between the rigor of science and the rigor of arts. The author is suggesting that rigorous, hard activity is better than easy activity. The correct answer, of course, is E, where he's saying, I appreciate the study of whales because it's limited, it's more difficult, just as though the sonnet is more difficult to handle. This is more difficult to handle, so the correct answer is, in fact, choice E. Number 23 sort of adds insult to injury if you've never really taken a SAT course. If you've never taken an SAT course, you really probably don't understand how overwhelmingly common the use of metaphor and analogies occur on the SATs. Indeed, this last question, question number 3, seems more of a nightmare that you might have in your freshman year at college when you take your first English literature class. Hopefully you'll pursue some technical subject and won't have to do it more than once. But there was a lot of metaphors and analogies. Here are some of them. We didn't even talk about all of them because some just weren't important. With any luck, you notice how many of these appeared on the test before we actually analyzed it. One of the things I always tell students is if you don't pay attention to metaphors, you're not going to make a really good score in the SAT reading. So the best characterization of his writing style is indeed E, an inclination to use metaphor and analogy in explanations. You might want to add the Latin phrase ad nauseam to that.